Well, hello, Peter Gray. I'm so excited to spend this time with you to inaugurate a new series of podcasts titled Prosocial Policies That Work. And I'm going to introduce the series in a minute. But first, to welcome you, Peter Gray, a longtime associate of mine on the topic of child development and education. So, in the first place, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, David.
You are the a psychologist who wrote the first textbook on psychology from an evolutionary perspective. And then you became involved with child development and education through the lens of your son's experience with public school, and have become a champion, a critic, first of all, of formal education and a champion of another form of education that we will be discussing. And so we'll return to that in just a minute. But first, let me introduce this series titled Prosocial Policies That Work. So this is a optimistic series, and it's going to showcase the fact that actually there's lots of things that work, prosocial policies that work. We have a strong logic for why they work. We could explain why they make sense. We have a huge evidential basis that they do work, and yet paradoxically, often despite this, they can be difficult to implement in the real world. There's some success stories, but very often there's barriers and challenges to implementing pro-social policies that work. So that's the series. And today we're going to focus on public school education. And um, and here first, let me note that where people can access your wonderful body of work, Peter, which is, of course, you've written books and you blog for Psychology Today. You're very active on Substack. And then a lot of your academic work can be found on petergray.org, where more material on you can be found. And we'll have liner notes in which people can get in touch with you and more or less engage on the basis of this podcast. So we're going to focus on a single topic, which is Common Core, that you wrote about in episode number 82 of your Substack. And could you describe, well, what is Common Core, um, what it is, and what's its aims, and what its underlying logic is? Because Common Core did have a pro-social intent.
Yes, a lot of things have a prosocial intent that
Yeah.
intentions often have unforeseen consequences, which should have been foreseen in this case. So, well, first of all, let me say I kind of got, if people had been following my Substack earlier, I have actually other previous Substack letters more specifically on Common Core that led up to my mentioning of it on letter number 82. But I got interested most recently in Common Core through this route. As many people know, there has been a dramatic increase in rates of anxiety, depression, suicide, beginning in 2010 up until about 2019. It's actually leveled off since then, but a pretty dramatic increase in all of this over that period of time. The popular theory of that increase, which was reinforced by a recent book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation, is that this was a period when almost all kids had smartphones. They were on smartphones all the time, and Haidt and others have developed theories as to why being on the smartphone would, partly because it detracts from other activities, partly because it isolates people in their view, partly because it creates un, um, unhealthy social comparisons, is the primary cause of that increase. Well, it turns out I had already been reviewing that research, and the research simply does not support that hypothesis. I've described various lines of evidence against that hypothesis. I've also critiqued Heicht's book, looking at the evidence that he presents. and showing the weakness of it. But just very briefly to mention that, first of all, this smartphones are throughout the world. European kids are not deprived of smartphones. They did not show this increase. All of the European Union actually showed a decline in teen suicides over this period, not an increase. Um, Moreover, the studies looking for correlations between smartphone use and indices of anxiety, depression, and so on are very mixed results. And there have been actually hundreds of such, or literally hundreds of such, dozens of reviews of such studies. And that book simply ignored all of those reviews, picked out, cherry picked the few studies that seem to show positive correlations, all of which have some weaknesses in those studies. It turns out that none of the people who actually do serious research in this area agree with that book. But yet, that book is having huge effects in that many, many people are taking vows that they're not going to allow their teenagers, even their teenagers, to have smartphones until they're 16 years old and so on. So I, in addition to wanting to show that this smartphone theory is wrong, I I wanted to come up with another hypothesis of it. So I asked the question, what in the United States and two or three other countries that also showed an increase in anxiety and depression beginning in the 2010s or a bit later, um, what happened in those countries that didn't happen in the rest of Europe, that didn't happen in most of the rest of the world? And I came up with changes in the education system. The Common Core, it turns out, is a drastic change in how we do schooling. It might not seem so drastic on paper, but in reality, it's been drastic. And especially in the early years of it, there was tremendous criticism of it from among teachers who felt like this was disrespecting them. It was not allowing them to use their own wisdom and knowledge and understanding of children in the classroom because they now had to teach to the test. They, as well as the kids, were now going to be judged based on these standardized tests, which measure a narrow range of what it is of what people need to learn in our culture, or what would be good to learn in our culture. So, so I began to look at the evidence regarding this. First of all, it should not be surprising that a change in the way that schooling is done could dramatically affect young people's mental health. Children spend more time in school than anywhere else except for home. And this is an environment in which they are not free. It's an environment in which they are basically locked in during the period of time that they're there. They're micromanaged. They're told exactly what they have to do. They are continuously evaluated in relation to their peers. This is a kind of job, if we called it a job, that no adult that I know would ever accept. This
Now,
is
this was true, Peter, for before Common Core. I mean,
absolutely.
to an extent. So
This
we
is
have
all true. This is all true before Common Core, and even before Common Core. Whenever, at least within recent centuries, whenever there has, or I'm sorry, recent decades, whenever there has been a survey among young people about what is making them anxious, depressed, or suicidal, school has always been the most frequently referred to. School pressures, school problems, always been referred to most frequently. Now, here's one line of evidence that Common Core made things worse. In addition to the things that I've changed, yeah, among other things, recesses were cut out or greatly reduced. Lunch hours, the average lunch hour is 20 minutes in U.S. schools now, has been ever since early years of Common Core. hardly enough
When was
time.
the onset of Common Core? Does it coincide with
The
this?
onset, the beginning of Common Core for the earliest adopting states was 2010, and by 2013, all states either had Common Core, most had Common Core, or others had something similar, which was required in order to get federal funding towards the schools. So the federal government mandated these changes, and they could mandate them because of the money, even though the federal support for schools is a relatively small fraction of the total cost of schools. It is still significant enough that schools bend
Sure.
to that.
Which administration was this that implemented this?
It was the so so in a sense it built up. In the Reagan administration was when you first began to have criticisms of the school system from the federal government. You had a book written at that time that made the case that our schools are so bad compared to the Chinese schools that we are falling behind. It's a national safety issue.
Sputnik kind of a
The
dynamic.
so already you had that. You had No Child Left Behind during the Bush administration, which was already moving in that direction, and then Common Core would have been actually in the Bush administration. Bush administration, I think it was the Bush administration, that the second Bush administration, that Common Core was passed. Now, Common Core came about from states getting together and saying, can we develop a common curriculum among the states instead of every state doing it individually? Can we develop a common curriculum that would satisfy the federal government's requirements? And that's why it's called Common Core, common among these states.
Peter, I'd like to
Interesting.
just note some benign intent here. No child left behind. That's benign intent. Please let the states have some decision-making agency here, not just the federal government. These are all, I think, uh, benign intent. It's not going to turn out well, but what I want to do is I want to uncover the underlying logic. Why did this make good sense to people? What was its underlying logic? Because everything has a logic. Everything we do have a logic.
Here's the logic to it. So, beginning some years before that was the beginning of the international PISA tests, the international tests that it's voluntary that countries take part in it, but increasing number of countries were taking part in this, where high school age students are being tested all with the same test across countries, of course, translated into their respective languages. The United States and various other countries, including the UK, were scoring poorly compared to the Chinese students. Of course, let's acknowledge that it's not all of China that was involved in this. It's Shanghai and some of the other places, and we don't know how many. We don't know what China was doing to those scores, right? But China was scoring. South Korea was scoring higher than us. Basically, the East Asian countries were scoring higher than us, higher than the UK,
Okay,
hiring
so this was an arms race, kind of metrics-based sort of
so
thing
became
that took over.
yeah, it's a little bit like when I was in a school, we were so worried that the Russians were way ahead of us in education, and suddenly they had Sputnik, right? When back, I'm old enough that I was in school when Sputnik went up, and suddenly we got concerned. Oh, they're way ahead of us, and we're in danger because of this, and so they began to push at that time all boys to study physics and engineering so we could catch up with the Russians. A little bit like that kind of mentality. Of course, we weren't behind the Russians, and the truth of the matter is, there's no way we were behind the Chinese in any of this. We were way ahead of them in terms of patents, in terms of new inventions, and so on and so forth, in terms of any reasonable measure of progress in these kinds of areas. But it became it you know, people always want to criticize the school system, and this became one kind of criticism of it. And it was kind of, in a certain sense, it was a kind of a right wing criticism of the school system because prior to that, we went through a phase that ever since we've had compulsory education, there's always been a certain number of people who try to push it in a more progressive direction, a little bit more choice among the kids, a little bit more freedom in what you're doing, a little bit more time for play and creative activities, a little bit less drill, and so on and so forth. And so we had been through that kind of a phase in the 1970s. And by the Reagan administration, there was a kind of conservative reaction against that and wanting to get back to serious drill. We
Back to
need to
basics, the three R's.
that was the kind of mentality that led to those kinds of changes too. So so the um, so the intent was, and the other portion at least of the stated intent was to rectify. This is where No Child Left Behind, that term comes from, was to do something about the education gap. It has long been true that people from economically poor families, kids from economically poor families, score lower, in fact, much lower on academic tests than those from economically wealthier families. And so the goal was to do something like about that, as if somehow you could mandate this change simply by declaring that it's not going to that you're not going to allow that to occur. The belief on at least some people's part was that by clamping down, really being serious about testing, drill, this was going to make everybody shape up and do the work, and we're going to get high scores. Now, the truth of the matter is, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, is that that education gap is greater now than it has ever been before. Common Core increased the gap. It did not decrease the gap. That should be no surprise. And the reason it should be no surprise is there's a lot of research that shows when you increase the pressure, what happens is you improve the performance of people who are always already doing well, and you reduce the performance of those for whom this is newer, this is stranger, this is something this the and moreover, the other thing that happened with No Child Left Behind is schools began. There's a certain literal sense that schools took it. They stopped failing anybody, and so a certain number of kids realized, I they're going to pass me even if I do nothing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so the combination of the added pressure, making it more difficult, making it more foreign, less pleasant.
Also pressure on the teachers because the teachers were being judged on this basis too.
And the
And so it
teachers are
was a
being
huge
judged.
incentive to
The
pass
teachers are being
students and
the
so on and
teachers are
so
being
forth.
judged. And there's actually instances of teacher cheating on these scores. When you begin to put pressure on people, they cheat. And there were a number of cases where school systems were throwing out the low scores. School systems were inviting the poor performers to stay home on the days of testing. This, once you have pressure like this, it doesn't matter whether you're a student or a teacher
Or a
or a
principal
school
or a
superintendent.
superintendent.
It invites cheating, and so a lot of that did happen. That's not my main point here, but that did happen. So at any rate, the result is it turns out that the scores on these standardized tests, even though Common Core was focused on the two realms that PISA most focuses on, which is mathematics and your native language, and in this case, of course, English reading. And so the focus was on those, and to some degree on science. And it turns out that the scores on all of these things on standardized tests, including the PISA tests, have gone down ever since Common Core started, even though the express purpose was to increase scores on those tests.
So
So,
be careful what you wish for.
exactly. So the other, so the, so one of the lines of evidence regarding my theory that the rise in anxiety and depression came from this change comes from surveys conducted by the American Psychological Association. You would never have heard of these surveys if it wasn't for me. They've been more or less buried, and I've been publicizing them. But in 2009, the American Psychological Association conducted a survey. So this was before Common Core, a survey called Stressed America. They actually do this survey, I think, almost every year, if not every year, with a couple of exceptions. But normally they only include adults. In 2009, they included teenagers. And then again in 2013, they included teenagers. Those are the only 2 years I know of where they included teenagers in the survey. Now, it happens by chance that the 2009 is just before Common Core. 2013 is after basically all states have Common Core. In 2009, if I might not be exact on this, but it was something like 43% of school age teenagers attributed their anxiety and depression to school. So you could check more than one thing on this checklist. School was the most commonly thing checked, 43% checked school. Same checklist in 2013, 83% checked school, a doubling of the number of high school age kids who said school was stressing them out. Also, the overall self rated level of stress, anxiety, depression was much higher in 2013 than in 2009. The American Psychological Association, this has not been reported by the regular press, but if you dig it out in their papers, the APA found that, according to this survey, high school age teenagers were the most stressed out people in America, and school was the primary source of their stress.
Something
So
we
that,
want to say here, Peter, I think it's obvious, but just to mark it, academic performance and mental health go together. They rise and fall together. So there's no trade-off between mental health and it's not as if you slave drive people, their mental health goes down, but their academic performance goes up. Not at all. Basically, they go up and down together. Isn't that true?
that is true. That is generally true. Now, on the other hand, uh, South Korea has the highest suicide rate among teenagers in the world. They also have the highest PISA scores.
Okay. Okay.
So there is an exception to that.
Okay. That's good to know.
But that doesn't mean that they're learning more. That means they're doing better on the tests.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of this has to do with metrification. The idea that if we want to improve, first we have to make it measurable, and then we go on from there. And then I think there's a great fallacy that's there, which isn't against measurement in some sense, but so often when the primary goal is the metrics, then there's just so many ways that you're not achieving what the metrics were intended to measure, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a certain within the realm of measuring human abilities, as soon as a measure becomes a goal, the measure becomes meaningless.
Yeah.
The measure is
And that's true for
subverted.
economics as well. And there's huge
Yeah,
parallels between
yeah.
economics and business and education, which is we can just note in passing. But I want to transition, Peter, uh, to now what does work, which you call school climate. Can we do that, or do you want to finish up
Sure.
with?
No, no, that's fine. Let's go to school climate because and the transition can be this too, that one of the reasons why mental health deteriorated and academic scores deteriorated is I am convinced that Common Core disrupted school climate. Common Core had a dramatically negative effect on school climate. It made everybody anxious. It took away teachers' abilities to feel comfortable in just being friendly with the kids and being able to support the kids in the way that they felt the kids needed being supported. It took away the ability for teachers to talk about the things they are interested in, which is often what leads to the best kind of education because they're truly excited about this and the kids can see it and and so it really removing recess, removing lunch hour, dramatically reducing the opportunities for kids just to get together and talk with one another,
Also,
project,
extracurricular
know them.
activities like the
This is
clubs, drama clubs, the music clubs, all of that
all
stuff.
of this kind of stuff, and so that disrupted that that really created a negative school climate. And I think that is one way of understanding the rise in anxiety and the decline in academic performance.
Okay, so what's the logic? Let's expand upon. You've already started the logic of why this thing called school climate. Basically, it's a benign prosocial environment. I think prosocial belongs as the primary adjective here. What's the logic for why that's so important for, well, basically for any human grouping? Because there's something like this is just any human group needs to have a good climate like this. But we need to be more specific than good climate. And I think that you're capable of being more specific. So just outline what are the ingredients of a good climate for anybody that also needs to be included in a school setting.
I think probably the best index of school climate is that the students and the teachers and the other people involved in the school like being there, want to be there. They identify with it. They feel good about it. They feel good about being a member of this. They feel supportive of one another. They feel the you know the there are certain recipes for trying to improve school climate, and generally those recipes say that school principals can play a major role if they set an example of both with the teachers and with the students of trying to get to know everybody personally, being concerned about them as human beings and not just about their job performance for teachers or their test scores for kids. Simple things like greeting the kids as they come into the school, ask them, how's your mom doing? Or things like that to show that you care about who they are. Opportunities for students to give at least some kind of feedback and kind of thoughts about how things operate in the school so they feel like they're part of even though it might be a small part realistically in the decision making process in the school. All of those things really contribute to school climate. And the reason that this is so important, even if your main concern, which my main concern is not, but if your main concern is academic performance, I think we place way too much emphasis on academic performance. But even if that's your main concern, people are going to, you can't make people learn. Let me repeat that. You cannot force people to learn. People have to want to learn what they're learning. It has to come from inside. There's a certain sense. I talk about self directed education, but there's a certain sense where all school, education is self directed. I have to want to know how to read, or I'm not going to really know how to read. I have to want to I have to have a reason to want to be able to multiply numbers or and I want to be able to do that. Or no matter how much training you give me, I might be able to mimic what you tell me, but I won't understand it. I won't have really learned it if you're just drilling me on it. It has to come from inside. So, to the degree that students feel like, yes, this is what I want to do, this is even if I want to do it just because I identify with this school and it's important to the school that I do it. That's not the perfect reason, but it makes a difference, right? It makes a difference. I think that was part of, that was part of Regents Academy. We like this school and the school wants us to perform well. So let's do
Sure, that's team,
it.
do it for the team. Well, let's segue to the evidence for this. So where we are now is we have a practice that doesn't work, even though it has a logic. Turns out it doesn't work, Common Core. Now we have an alternative set of practices, which we're calling school climate, which does work. It has a logic too, or compelling logic. And now what we need is to evaluate the evidence that it does work. And so that's the next section of our conversation. And I'm going to take the next section because, as you just alluded to, the Regents Academy was something that I helped to form in Binghamton, New York. So, I'm going to take a few minutes to describe that and then turn back to you for a more general review of the evidence for the prosocial school climate. So with the Regents Academy, I had the opportunity to help in the design of a school within a school for at-risk youth. And the school climate that we implemented had a very specific recipe, which you're familiar with, Peter. It was based on Eleanor Ostrom and her core design principles. And this is the social climate we claim that all groups need. Therefore, school groups also need them. And the ingredients of the school climate, I'm going to just race through them, but they make such good sense that as long as we're relying upon this logic, then I think our listeners will just be nodding their heads from beginning to end. Number one, a strong sense of identity and purpose. It has to be meaningful. There has to be an important reason to be in this group, and we need to know who's a member, who's not, so on and so forth. So the meaning of the group and the identity and the boundaries of the group. Here's where school spirit comes in and things like this. Number two, benefits proportional to the cost. If you're, it must be the case that if you're if you're putting work into the group, then you get the benefits. Not sustainable for some members of the group to get the benefits and others for them to do the work. Fair and inclusive decision making. Everyone in the group should have a say in the decisions made by the groups. And here right away, you can see the monumental failure of many school social environments in which the students have no say in what takes place within the school. So the idea that everyone should have a say in what a group does, that makes perfect sense. It has a strong logic. And just think of the massive violation that occurs in many school settings. Agreed upon behaviors need to be monitored. We need to know whether you're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Are we succeeding in our objectives? And if we're not, there has to be some correction. And that means positive rewards for good behavior and what's called graduated sanctions for bad behavior, which starts out friendly and well-meaning and only escalates when necessary. There need to be conflict resolution mechanisms. The school needs to have elbow room, or the group needs to have elbow room for making its own decisions. And here again, we have the massive violation of that with Common Core, basically deprived the teachers and the students of agency in terms of what they were going to do, and then appropriate relations with other groups. So with apologies for going through it so fast, that's the social climate basically that we intended to implement. Another point to make is that we were good boys and girls. We did a randomized control trial, and so we recruited twice as many students that we could accommodate. We randomly chose those that were admitted to the school, and then the rest was a comparison group that experienced the normal school routine so that we could actually have a good basis for saying, does this work or not? And to make a long story short, I'll be providing links for anyone to learn more. The results were spectacular. And so these students in the school, not only did they vastly outperform the um, comparison group, but they performed on a par with the average student in the school. This was true for non-academic performance, in addition to the Regents Academy. So in many ways, because we couldn't control this part of it, we did have to teach to the test, the statewide test that everyone takes. Nevertheless, we were able to do that. Um, um, in addition to other activities that were what the students wanted to do. And then the final point I'll make, which for me is among the most remarkable, is that not only was there this amazing beneficial effect, but it took place quickly within the first quarter. And what that meant was that these students living very hard lives were also resilient, and they were able to recognize a prosocial social climate. And like turtles coming out of their shells, they were able to respond just as soon as they realized they were going to benign prosocial social environment, they basically came out of their shells and they began to flourish. And so, what an amazing experience to have. And first of all, just comment on that briefly, Peter. And I'm going to begin to quote from your letter number 82 here when we get to a broader base of evidence. But please say whatever you like about the Regents Academy, which I know that you've learned a lot about.
Yeah, no, I think the Regents Academy is an excellent illustration of, it's the most powerful illustration I know of what can be done when you focus on school climate. When you just really, you make it, you involve the students, you make them, this to be a pleasant place, they become part of the group, they become motivated to do, to achieve by the measure that this school took necessarily because it's within the regular school system by that measure to achieve by that measure. And for this group of students, I'm sure it was extraordinarily valuable to achieve by that measure. They left that school, I'm sure, not feeling like I'm a failure. I can do this stuff. That I'm sure was a huge difference. And the fact that they not only achieved and as you said, generally speaking, the mental health and the academic performance tend to go together. But the fact that the assessment of mental health that the school system did showed that they had really jumped in mental health compared to the control group that were in the regular school, and even at a par with and maybe higher than those that, had already been achieving within the Binghamton High School. So it's a very powerful study.
And it shows, I
I
mean, one of the
regularly refer to it when I give talks.
well, that's awesome. I've been ARCO is a very important part of my life, and it really among the results it shows that this all kids need this. The whole spectrum of performance spectrum. It's not just the at-risk students that need this. Everyone needs. All human beings need this as part of the message. Now, for the next segment of our talk, I want to really emphasize the point that not only is there evidence for pro-social policies that work, but there's let me be profane, a shitload of evidence. And you've already alluded to hundreds and hundreds of studies that are demonstrating that these things, which make sense against the background of the appropriate logic, all the evidence we could want. And so I'm going to quote some of the meta-analyses from your letter and then invite you to talk about one such study in detail, because I think very often when we just say hundreds of studies, it doesn't land in any way. And so I want to spend enough time on this for it just to have the impact that it deserves to have, that so much evidence has accumulated for pro-social policies that work, that really there need be little doubt that there's something a shovel ready basically to be implemented. So what you say in your letter number 82, dozens of research studies have revealed positive correlations between school climate as assessed by students or teachers or both, and the mental health or academic performance or both of students. One review identified 48 studies of correlations between indices of a positive school climate and indices of students' mental well-being, 46 of which reveal statistically significant positive correlations. Then you provide the reference. Another review identified 78 studies correlating indices of school climate with students' academic achievements, all but one of which reveal statistically significant positive correlations. Such correlations have been found both within and across schools. In other words, within any given school, students who report a more positive social climate score higher on measures of academic achievement and mental health than students who report less positive social climate. And students at schools ranked higher in school climate score higher on measures of academic achievement on average, so on and so forth. These correlations hold true even when demographic variables, such as socioeconomic backgrounds of the students, are controlled for statistically, and longitudinal studies suggest that the correlation reflects, at least in part, a causal relationship between school climate and students of mental health. And now what you do next, Peter, and what I invite you to recount in your own words, is a particular, the best, most thorough longitudinal study that you found relating school climate to mental health. And so this is a study in Australia. Please take it from here.
Yes, okay. Yes, I think I remember enough of that study to say something about it. That so this was so whenever you're looking at a correlation, there's questions about cause and effect. The so if you're looking at a correlation between school climate and academic performance and mental health measures, is it that the academic performance and the mental health is influencing the rating of school climate, or is it, as we would like to think, that school climate is influencing the academic performance and mental health? So, in these correlational studies, although it's reasonable to assume that the causal direction would be that improved school climate improves performance, unless you do an experiment as you did. It's a little bit hard to say for sure that this was a causal effect rather than a correlation of some third cause. So one way to get around that is to at least partly get around that is to do a longitudinal study. And so this study in Australia was a longitudinal study where they followed students up. If I remember, it was from a variety of different schools, something like 18 or 20 different schools, starting with kids in the seventh grade. And they assessed them for their questionnaire about school climate as they're experiencing their sense of the school climate, positive or negative, and they're doing this periodically as they go along through 2 more years of schooling. And what they found is that positive assessment of school climate precedes an increase in a measure of resilience, a measure of psychological resilience, which also precedes a measure of mental health generally, a lower level of anxiety, lower level of depression. So when you see that kind of a chain, that the positive school climate predicts an increase in how they're feeling about themselves and how they're doing in school as they go along, that's that's at least fairly powerful evidence for a causal effect. The school climate, improved school climate, is producing these improvements in their feelings and their performance.
Yeah, exactly. And you describe another study. If we're interested in the achievement gap, and then not only do we want everyone to do better, but we want to narrow the achievement gap, then we have both compelling logic and also data to show that a safe pro-social school climate actually narrows the achievement gap. It has an even more positive effect on people on the low end than the high end. Could you elaborate on that theme and then maybe describe the study that you describe in your paper, the Israeli study with Ruth Berkowitz?
Right. Yeah, actually, I got interested in the in the question of the school gap some years ago, and I wrote a Psychology Today blog post. I think it was titled "Mend the Gap," about various attempts to reduce the achievement gap. And I, at that time, reviewed the literature more thoroughly than I did more recently. But at that time, I reviewed the literature, really looking at papers that were aimed at assessing ways of reducing that gap between how the rich and poor perform in school. And I came to the conclusion, as others had who have reviewed that also, that the only method that had been reliably proven to work was improving school climate. In other words, reducing school size by itself, if it didn't improve school climate, that didn't do it. Reducing class size didn't do it. More money to the schools didn't do it. Um, more, 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 more integration within the school. So, in other words, instead of having poor kids go to one school and rich kids school another, you find just as big a gap if they're all going to the same school as you do if they're going to separate schools. The back gap between rich and none of these things, which had been hypothesized and been touted as ways to reduce this gap, none of them reduce the gap except school climate. And at that time, I found quite a number of studies, and then now even more studies showing that it changes school climate does it. So the so this seems to be whatever else might reduce the gap probably does so by improving school climate, by improving, and one way of thinking of that is by making the change that lead kids from economically poor families to feel comfortable there and to feel wanted there, to feel like this is my home too. It's not just those rich kids' home. This is where I belong,
Well,
and
there's a
I can
study,
do this.
Peter, that brings to mind it's college, but the study basically was had a 1 hour intervention
Yeah,
that increased a sense of belonging in minority students.
yeah.
And this was 1 hour. And
Oh,
then they
unbelievable.
tracked the students for the 4 years and they showed these huge performance gains just because the students in their heads, they thought, I belong. I mean,
Exactly.
it's so sad to think. But on the other hand, it's so amazing to think that just by changing that one little thing, you can have years effect. And on physical health, they tracked physical health visits to the school, infirmary, in addition to academic performance. A 1 hour intervention that made students feel that they belonged. Amazing.
Yeah, no, I believe that. That's then of course you have to follow up and make sure they continue to feel that they
Well, and
belong.
this was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It wasn't just like one thing. That
Right.
basically is one thing that set other things in motion. So
Yeah.
they would conduct themselves thereafter, and
Right.
so that's an important point to make.
Right.
Well,
Right.
now we come to the final segment of our um, interview here, which is so we now have something which makes sense. It has a strong logic behind it. All the evidence you could ask for that it works. And now sometimes that results in successful implementation, such as our own Regents Academy, but very often it doesn't. And that for some reason, it's still difficult to implement these pro-social policies that that work, which was the case for our own Regents Academy. Despite its success and the numbers that we had to prove it, the program was terminated after a number of years, and you have your own experiences in the literature that you've read. So let's address the question of why is it that these policies face challenges even after they've been shown to work and have strong logics. That's so paradoxical in some ways.
So that's a interesting. I think to me the basic problem is that we are mistaken in what the goal of schooling should be. And and that mistake makes school not work really for anybody very well. We have this belief that the purpose of school is to get all children to learn the same things in the same way at the same time. That is just not biologically reasonable. You can get people to do it. And if you improve school climate, people will do it better
Yeah,
than
right.
otherwise. But it is not normal human behavior. It is not normal that everybody should be able to read by the age of 6. Some kids can read, like my son, nobody taught him. He could read by the time he was 4. There are other kids who could do that. Some kids aren't ready to read until considerably later. Some kids are interested in this, others are interested in that. Why should everybody learn this just because that's on the curriculum when that is every bit as important to the world as this? And if I want to study that, why shouldn't I be following that instead of this? So we have a system that is trying to make everybody learn the same tiny slice of all of knowledge. It's a tiny slice. Why should we be making everybody learn the same slice? It doesn't make any sense. we should we should we should value the diversity of people's interests and people's goals and people's what people want to learn. But you cannot do that if you have a school system that's structured the way our school system always has been structured. So I've been involved in schools that are structured entirely differently from that. And they work. There's no question but what they work. It revolutionized my thinking when I first became involved in observing this kind of a school. It doesn't look like a school. And there's no way you can create a compromise between this and a typical school. You've got
Well,
to
Peter,
kind
let
of
me
go
let
the
me
whole way with this.
yeah. So because I'm very familiar with your work, and so basically, one thing you're saying is the need for a huge paradigmatic shift, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
And then we have things like the Sudbury Valley School and so on, which do this, and they do it well. Um, I think it's also the case, and you would agree, because it's what we've been talking about, that even if you have the constraints of a public school, there's things you can, there's things that you can do. And so I think that you agree with that also. And I also want to note successes in addition to the challenges. That this is a glass that's at least partly full, thank heavens. And maybe you could note, let's just take the paradigmatic change. The schools that are in the mold of the Sudbury Valley School, are these growing? Is this a movement that's succeeding and growing? Is there some success to report before we talk about the challenges and why they're not doing still better?
I'd say that the number of Sudbury schools has grown. There are Sudbury schools internationally, but it hasn't grown at a really rapid rate. These kinds of schools have been around for decades. Lots of evidence of their success. There are thousands of graduates of such schools doing well out there in the world, and yet this is would be regarded as a very strange school to most people, and most people would not consider sending their child to such a school because it is so different from the norm. And we are, as human beings, we're creatures of norms. We do what other people do, and we're suspicious of things that seem very different from what other people do. And so I think that's a big part of the problem. What has grown, especially in recent years, is homeschooling. And homeschooling all homes, I've become convinced all homeschooling is in the direction of self-directed education. Parents simply don't, even if they intend to, they don't force curriculum the way a school does. They adapt what they're doing to their kids' interests. They don't spend hours every day sitting and doing lessons. They spend a couple hours maybe doing it, and the rest of the time the kids are playing and exploring and doing what they want to do. And homeschooling has turned out to be, in fact, public schools are worried because they're losing population to homeschooling. In many, many states, they're
Are
losing.
there good studies talk about evidential basis
And
that document the benefits of homeschooling on
well,
average?
there is definitely, homeschoolers generally, when you control for other factors, do better in college if they go on to college than those who don't. Homeschoolers are happier. There's research which I've been somewhat involved in, showing that when kids are suffering in school psychologically, or they've been diagnosed with ADHD, or they've been diagnosed with some learning disability, taken out for homeschooling, the disability goes away. They learn to read. ADA, they can go off the stimulant drugs if they're diagnosed. I've done some research along that line, preliminary research, not published, but with enough data that I'm convinced that it's real. So there's a lot of evidence that for those who do it, it works. Now this is a different question from would it work for everybody? But for those who do it, it works. For those who do it and stay with it. So that's a growing trend. There's also this was really exacerbated during COVID. There are a lot of people who took their kids out of school during COVID, not just kept them home during the lockout period, but took them out of school for homeschooling mostly. But then, because there were so many people doing it, they started these little micro schools, these small little schools that are not necessarily Sudbury type schools of the kind of completely philosophy, but there's schools where there's a lot more choice, where there's automatically good school climate. It's small, the kids know one another, the parents who are involved with it know one another. They're trying to create a nice environment for their kids. And this is a very growing experience. We don't have enough data on how they do as adults at this point to know, in that sense, how they're working. My way of sometimes I've been asked. I've sometimes testified to government people in other countries, especially Germany and the Netherlands, and once in France, about why they should be permitting a range of experimental schools that they don't currently permit. And what I always say when they ask, well, how do we evaluate how the school works? I always say there's really I know of only two ways to evaluate how a school works. The first way to evaluate it is by looking and seeing if the kids are happy there. If the kids are not happy, it doesn't work. Automatically, it's a bad school if the kids are not happy. So the first step is in evaluation is are the kids happy? The second step, you've got to wait until you're looking at graduates. Do these happy kids growing up, do they, how are they as adults? Can they make a living? Do they live moral lives? Do they stay within the law? Do they do the things that we want citizens in our culture to do? Those are the two ways you can evaluate a school. You cannot evaluate a school by seeing if everybody can read at age 6. You cannot evaluate a school by testing them on certain realms of knowledge
Yeah, and there's plenty of
because
studies, Peter, I know, which show short-term gains which get washed out and then disappear over a longer time frame and even get worse. So as you know.
the important things that people need to learn are not the academic stuff. You can learn academic stuff anytime. I mean, I've done studies of kids graduating from Sudbury Valley and kids who were homeschooled by the method called unschooling, where there's no curriculum. The kids are just following their own interests. They go on to college at high levels. They get into college, even though they've never taken a test before, and they do well in college. Why do they do well? When I ask them why, they say, I am greatly advantaged compared to the other kids because I've been taking charge of my whole life. I know how to take charge of my life. I know how to take responsibility. I made a decision, a mature decision to go to college. And I have a reason to go to college, and I want to get the most out of it that I can. They are not the kids going out drinking at night. They are not the kids. The biggest complaint they have is how immature the other students are. So the most important thing, it's not, we think it's so damn important to learn what quadratic equations are and how to solve them. How many adults do you know who can remember what a quadratic equation is? What really you need to learn is who I am. What am I interested in? What is my place in the world? How do I figure out how to get to my place in the world? You need lots of time to play, to explore, lots of time to try different interests. This is what happens at a Sudbury school. This is what happens at a school. This is what happens among homeschoolers in the method of self-directed homeschooling. And that's what creates a successful adult. You know how to, you know, it's not so important that you know, let's say, the difference between meiosis and mitosis. What's important is if ever on earth I have to know that difference, I could find that out pretty quickly. you know? So it's important that you know that you could learn, that you can adapt, you can learn when whatever you want to know, anytime you want to know it. And that's even more true today than it's ever
Sure,
been
with
true in
AI
the
and all of
past.
that. Yeah, well, Peter, you're like the Pied Piper, and I'm happy to follow you down that road. No problem.
I
I
hope
do
I'm
want
not
to
leading you over a cliff.
I do want to return to formal schooling and the wiggle room that is possible within the formal schooling. And even there, it's hard to move in this direction. Despite the compelling logic, the evidence, even there. So just what's your diagnosis for why is that and what could be done about it? And just
Well, I actually, I wear two hats in a way. In one, with one hat, I'm helping people get out of school for this alternative, but I also work with schools.
yeah, I
Through
know you
the
do.
Let Grow organization, we've instituted something called Play Club in schools, which is an hour of free self-directed play, age-mixed play at school where the teachers who monitor it are instructed not to intervene because children learn so much when they solve their own problems in play rather than a teacher stepping in and solving the problem. This has been very successful. We've instituted in schools a program called the Let Grow Challenge, which is, and there are probably throughout the country thousands of teachers now doing this, which is the teachers who adopt this give an assignment, typically once a week. Mostly this is elementary school, but some middle schools do it, of asking the kids to do something outside of school that they've never done before. Do it independently, not with an adult with you helping you do it, but something you want to do by yourself or with other kids independently and you've never done before. Ideally, something that you might be a little scary to you, but you still really want to do it. But of course, you have to get your parents' permission to do it, right? So we can't tell you to do something that your parents wouldn't agree to do. So you pick something to do, and then you have to talk with your parents, and then they're sort of also given a little instruction how to negotiate with your parents. So, so let's say, for example, so we're living in a world, as you know, David, where kids are being deprived of opportunities to do things that you and I could do as kids anytime we wanted, such as ride your bicycle at age 10 to visit friends. Kids are not being allowed to do that. So an example might be a girl, an age 10 girl, who says, so for my project is I want to ride my bicycle all by myself to my friend's house 2 blocks away. So she says to her mom, so I've got this assignment at school from school. So immediately the mom has to pay attention, right? I mean,
Yeah,
this is a
mom,
school
man
assignment. This is the genius of this
can't say
because it's
no. That is
it's a
genius.
school assignment. She can't just say no. And so here's what I would like to do, but I have to get your permission to do it. That's part of the assignment. And so I'd like to ride my bicycle all by myself to my friend's house. And the mom says, oh no, I can't let you. That's way too dangerous. I can't let you do that. So then the girl says, well, how about if I just ride my bicycle around the block and you can sit on the front stoop and watch me go around the corner and watch me come back. And so the mom reluctantly agrees to that. And then this is an actual case, by the way. Lenore Skenazy, my colleague, actually observed cases like this. So then the child does this, and the amazing thing is not only is the little girl glowing with pride that she did this, but the mom is too. The mom sees the kid glowing, and the mom is glowing with pride that she allowed the kid to do this and that her kid to do it. so now next week she's a little bit more inclined to allow the child to do what the child wanted to do in the first place. It breaks into this cycle of restraint and fear and leads to a new cycle in pride in my child's abilities to do new things. So this also, by the way, some of the teachers say this improves classroom climate because the kids come back and they talk about what they're doing outside of school. And so the kids are known to one another, not just for what they're doing in school, but a little bit about what they're doing outside. Oh, I cooked dinner for my family. That was my project this week. Hey, how did that go? And learn a little bit about the family and what you cooked and so on and so forth. And it makes the school classroom a little bit more of a human classroom where the kids are sharing what they're doing outside of school as well. So these are a couple of
Perfect.
the things we're
I mean, it's
doing in the
brilliant.
regular
I mean,
school.
that's such a package of practices that you just set in motion with a touch, and then there's these cascading
Yeah.
effects. That's really brilliant. And so, Peter, it's always such a delight talking with you, and I'm really happy that this is the first of our series. And we're going to have a print transcript, liner notes, and so on and so forth, and ways basically for anyone listening to this, either as an individual or even better as some form of organization, a school, a homeschooling group, anything done with others. And then, of course, they should be thinking of the very same social climate they're trying to create for their children, they should be creating for themselves. And so I think my organization, Prosocial World, and your organization, Let Grow, and all of your different activities stand ready to assist in those efforts.